Hi, my name is Stephanie Kliethermes. I am Research Director for the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine, as well as an Associate Professor in the Department of Orthopedics and Rehabilitation at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The purpose of today's lecture is to talk a little bit about the Delphi method. And what I will do is introduce you to what it is, when and why you would use it, and then talk a little bit about how you would actually implement it. Then I'll turn over the microphone to my colleague, Dr. Irfan Asif, who will go through an example of one way in which he used the Delphi method in a recent sports and exercise medicine research project. So the Delphi method comes from some humble beginnings. It actually was started by the Rand Corporation during the Cold War. They had a question, they wanted to forecast the impact of technology on warfare, and their usual techniques for answering questions weren't working. So they tried to develop some theoretical models as well as some quantitative models, but they just didn't have the data to get the answers that they needed. And they also tried to conduct some focus groups to try and better understand their question about the impact of technology, but they were running into issues with certain individual voices dominating those focus groups and felt like they weren't getting the answers they needed. So, what they decided to do was use the systematic approach to ask a group of experts to provide their opinions on the probability of the frequency and intensity of possible enemy attacks. And they also asked questions related to what this group felt like the number of atomic bombs were needed to destroy specific targets. And they kept going through this iterative process with this panel, this group of experts until they reached consensus. And so the Delphi method was born. Now, the purpose of the Delphi method is to achieve agreement among a group of experts on a certain issue or on a given topic where none previously existed. And there are numerous definitions to the Delphi technique, but I've put two on the screen here that I tend to use. So the first says a multi-stage survey, which attempts ultimately to achieve consensus on an important issue. What I like about this, it gets to the idea that this is an iterative process that often is implemented through surveys to obtain consensus. And then the other consensus is a little bit more substance to it, and or definition has a little bit more substance to it. And this is from Delphi and Helmer, and they define it as a method used to obtain the most reliable consensus of opinion of a group of experts by a series of intensive questionnaires interspersed with controlled feedback. So I guess this gives you a little bit more details about the Delphi method, but it really hones in on the idea that this is a systematic approach to achieve consensus using a group of individuals, experts. So what would I liken the Delphi technique to? I actually liken it to that early 2000s show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? I'm not sure if that show is still being aired today, but I think it kind of gives you an idea of how this process unfolds. So if you think about the person sitting in the hot seat that has to answer questions, and if they don't know that question, they can go to some lifelines, right? And one of those lifelines is the audience. So in this situation or this analogy, the audience is serving as your panel of experts, and that individual in the hot seat is like the principal investigator or the person conducting the study that's trying to get a research question answered. And so they ask the panel of experts or the audience to answer a closed form question, and they're hoping to achieve consensus on that question so that they ultimately get the right answer. And so you can imagine a series of these questions, a series of asking the audience to start putting those together, you have essentially the makings of a Delphi method study. Now, before I get into some of the particulars of the Delphi method, I really wanted to just talk about what level of evidence this provides. So we're all familiar with this hierarchy of evidence pyramid. You've seen this numerous times, and we know as you move up the period, typically the quality of evidence increases. So the Delphi method is at the bottom. This is solely based on expert opinion. There is no data that is introduced as part of this approach, and oftentimes, most times, data doesn't exist, so that you really can't use any other method or approach that's higher up on the table or on the pyramid. But what I should say that if there are alternative ways to answer your research question that may involve collecting data, conducting maybe a case control study, cohort study, whatever it might be, then you should pursue those ways, right? Because they're stronger forms of evidence. But if you need to decide that you need to rely on expert opinion for various reasons, then the Delphi method is an important approach to consider, because it does provide that scaffolding and it does provide this systematic way of obtaining consensus from a group of experts. So when would you use the Delphi method? You want to use the Delphi method if you're looking to set priorities. So within the American Medical Society Sports Medicine, within our collaborative research network, we've used this before to try and identify research priorities. If you're looking to develop policy or create guidelines, and I say more on that later because that's going to be the example that Dr. Asif talks with you about, or if you want to just try and make some forecasts or predictions about the future. So these are all reasons in which you may decide to use the Delphi method. I really like this quotation pulled from Keeney's book in 2001, published in 2001, related to the Delphi method, where he says this method is only useful when the research question or problem does not lend itself to precise analytical techniques. So going back to that hierarchy of evidence pyramid, if you can answer your research question in a different way, potentially involving some sort of prospective primary research study, then you may want to consider doing that. You should consider doing that over this Delphi method, which is still based on expert opinion on that lowest rung of hierarchy of evidence. So what are some key attributes of a Delphi study? First is the anonymity of response among participants. So your participants are your panel of experts that you form at the onset of the study. And what's important about this is this allows free reign for your panel of experts to truly express their opinions and beliefs. And they're not influenced or dominated by certain individuals who have really maybe high profile reputations or just loud voices that are often heard over some of the quieter voices in a room. This process is also characterized by iteration. And what's neat about this idea of iteration is that at each stage of this process, or your panel of experts has an opportunity to change their responses. And because they have that opportunity to change their responses, that's how your group or your panel of experts can eventually hone in on consensus for a certain statement or topic. Also, a hallmark of this process is feedback. So at each stage of the Delphi method, the investigative team is going to give the panel of experts feedback from the previous round. So they are all going to understand and know what the group is feeling, and they can assess then whether or not what they feel is in agreement with the group, or it may be on one of the outliers from the group. And finally, there's always some sort of statistical response or summary. Now, when I say statistical response, this is not high-level statistics. You don't need a stats degree to be able to analyze this data. All you're doing is really trying to summarize the responses. So you're using maybe means and standard deviations, or medians and interquartile ranges, or even something as simple as frequencies and percentages. So this is something that everyone can do to actually create these summaries. So here's just an example of a Delphi round that I participated in recently. And if you see here, this is kind of a second or third round of the Delphi process, because I've been given responses, a distribution of responses from the group from a previous round. And you can see the investigators here, they separated the panel of experts into different groups. That's not necessary. Oftentimes you're just given one overall distribution, which is fine. And this particular group had a lot of researchers involved, or a lot of individuals involved in the panel of experts. And so this is why they kind of broke this down. And then the statement that I'm responding to is on the bottom. So in this particular example, I had to assess whether or not I felt this statement was important to the definition of primary cam morphology. And in my initial response, you can see highlighted in yellow, I initially said this was critical. So I put in a yellow. And as I'm looking at this, I can see that my response of 7 fits pretty well within the distribution of responses from the other panel of experts. So now during this round, I can decide if I want to increase that number, decrease that number, or keep it the same. I don't remember what I did. I'm sure I probably kept it the same, but I might have just chose 7 again. But if I had potentially been an individual who selected 1 or 2 on this statement, and I see a majority of the panel of experts is selecting this as maybe a critical part of the definition, then I may need to reassess why I think that way versus why the group may think the other way, and then decide, do I want to maybe move my response a little bit further to the right? So this is just one example of kind of how the Delphi process unfolds. So the original or classic Delphi method goes like this. You often have 2 or more rounds, so somewhere between 3 or 5 is pretty typical. And these rounds of questionnaires are typically administered by email these days, or virtually. So, you're not sending things in the mail or anything like that. But the first round is unique because it's it's open-ended. So you get the panel of experts receives a slate of questions that are often open-ended and just trying to get some background information on a topic. So really just trying to suss out what the panel of experts feel about a given topic. And what's interesting about that, so then the research team will take those open-ended questions and turn them into closed form statements or questions that the panel of experts then has to respond to in round two. So once they've assimilated that information, they will then send the responses back to the expert panel in a subsequent round in the form of closed form questions or statements. And then the expert panel is asked to rank or rate those statements within that second questionnaire based on their expert opinion. And these rounds continue until consensus is reached on all of the items or on some of the items. So it may be the case that there are a few items in your questionnaire that the expert panel will not agree upon. And you can see that you're not getting closer and closer to consensus with subsequent rounds, and they're just going to be split. And so at that point, you can decide that you're done with done using Delphi system, Delphi approach, and that you will close your study at that point. So this technique has strengths and limitations, right? One of the limitations, or one of the reasons why it's criticized, is that there are no formal or universally agreed upon guidelines on actually how to use this method. And so that's a limitation, and one reason why people critique this method. But a strength of that is that it allows individuals to kind of modify it in certain ways so that it works well with their research question as well as their team of experts, their panel of experts, and their research personnel, so that they can administer this Delphi approach in a way that was going to work best for them. So certainly that's kind of a double-edged sword, and there are what's called modified Delphi techniques or modified Delphi studies that happen all the time because they kind of deviate from the standard form. We're not going to get into that during this lecture, but just know that those do exist, and there are alternatives to this just central core kind of process. So let's just walk through that a little bit more in detail. What are you going to do first? Well, first you need to identify, is this question worthy of using the Delphi method? So can I answer my research question in any other way, including developing and conducting a formal research study that collects quantitative data? If your answer is no, I can't do that, or I need the answer to this question before quicker than I could if I were to conduct an actual research study, then this might be an appropriate approach for you to take. So if you decide that, yep, the Delphi method is what we need to do or what we want to do, then you need to go about thinking about selecting your experts. There's no consensus on the number of experts that you should have on your team. I tend to say 8 to 12 or 10 to 15, somewhere in that range is probably a pretty good number to strive for. If you have fewer than 8 individuals on your panel of experts, I think you're running the risk of not getting all the viewpoints that you necessarily need to have at the table. But if you have more than 12 to 15, then I'm not sure you're actually adding more unique information than you would have gleaned from an original smaller group. So things to keep in mind. I've seen Delphi studies happen with 50 to 100 individuals on the panel of experts. And so part of it also just depends on the topic area, the time, and the resources you have to actually conduct this. I should also say that, when you're thinking about your panel of experts, I'll talk about this more in a few minutes, but they obviously need to have some sort of knowledge and experience with the topic, and they need to be willing to participate. So once you've established your panel of experts, they've all agreed, then you're going to jump into round 1 of the Delphi process, and this is the classically open-ended question. So really just trying to brainstorm and generate ideas from the groups that you can then take all the information that they have, synthesize that, and you're going to do that via qualitative analysis. And this can be incredibly formal. It can be a little less formal. So you can use formal statistical software if you want to, and really do a thorough qualitative analysis, or you can do some strategic mapping and things like that, using some qualitative techniques to actually synthesize this information. But ultimately, what you're trying to do at this stage is you're trying to take the information that all the individuals individual experts on your panel identified and try and group statements that are similar together, so that you can then turn those into closed form questions for your panel to respond to in a subsequent round. So once you've kind of analyzed those qualitative responses and turned them into a closed form questionnaire, you're going to give that back to your panel of experts. And here they're going to rank the importance of all of these questions from the first round. And like I said, they're closed-ended. Once you get those responses back, then you need to assess whether consensus was achieved. And so how do you do that? Well, there's no universal agreement on what it means to achieve consensus. I've seen anywhere from just a simple majority, so 51% of your panel needs to agree on a certain statement to achieve consensus, versus a little higher threshold of upwards to 80% of your panel should agree. I tend to gravitate towards the 80%. I think that just sets a higher bar, and it really demonstrates more agreement than a 51% threshold. But you can make that decision with your research team. You just should identify what that threshold is before you get started on this process. If you have kind of more of a continuous scale, you can consider an IQR, or an interquartile range, which measures the spread of responses, and you want that spread of responses to be less than 1.0. Now, importantly, I think this is an important but subtle point. Consensus does not mean they're identifying the correct answer. So you may have a statement that you ask them to rank, and if they achieve consensus, it doesn't mean that that's the correct answer. All it means is that the panel agrees with one another. And you may find that future research down the line shows that, yes, the panel agreed on this particular statement, but once we've gathered data, done a few studies, science shows that that's actually not correct. Like that's a whole different scenario. So, and that's actually identifying truth, whereas what we're trying to do here is identify agreement or consensus. So we're going to continue through this process in subsequent rounds. Now, in the subsequent rounds, it's really important to be able to that you inform your participants or your panel of experts of the results of a prior round, including making sure that they know what they responded earlier. And they're not going to remember, so you want to make sure that you make that information available to them. And this gives them the chance to look at the distribution of responses, see where they sit in relation to the expert group, and then give them a chance to revise or shift their responses accordingly. What's nice about these subsequent rounds is if you've achieved consensus on an item in an earlier round, you can remove that from your questionnaire. There's no need to have the group continually achieve consensus on an item that's already achieved consensus. So it does kind of streamline the process a little bit. I also like to, just as a side note, offer the option for comments occasionally on some of my items or certain groups of items, so that if there's something that comes up that we're just glaringly missing, as an expert or a member of our panel can actually identify that for us, and it may inform how we approach future rounds. So in general, this is how you conduct a Delphi method, a Delphi study. And like I said before, there are some nuances and there's some ability to fluctuate with, make some changes or modify this approach, but this is generally how the process unfolds. So I just want to talk a little bit more before I turn the microphone over to Dr. Asif about selecting your expert panel, because certainly this is not going to be a random sample. You're not going to come to the AMSSM office and ask for us to randomly select 15 AMSSM members to comprise your panel of experts. Why? Because these individuals have to have knowledge and experience and interest in the topic that you're selecting. Now, this does raise the risk of selection bias, which is another criticism that you sometimes hear in relation to this approach. So you need to think critically about how you're selecting your expert panel. If you're just choosing friends or people you know, you may not be getting the range of voices and expertise that you need to really identify, to do this rigorously and to identify consensus among a wide range of individuals. So how would you think about, what would you think about what qualifications for the expert panel? Well, no, just because they have knowledge of a particular topic does not necessarily make them experts, right? If they are well read in an area but don't have experience, that may preclude them from being an expert. But some things to think about when you're thinking about inclusion criteria could be the number of publications they have, their geographical location, years of experience, so years of clinical experience in a particular area. All of these criteria are things that you will want to think about before you form the panel, so that you have this systematic approach to really forming this. Like I mentioned earlier, there's little agreement about the size of the panel. I would say make sure you're in that 8 to 10 range, but if you want to go higher, you certainly can. And one thing I have not mentioned is that the response rates are key. So your expert panel needs to feel like they're engaged in the study and that you care that they're engaged and participating and they should be interested in this topic. So what you don't want to see is your expert panel dwindle in subsequent rounds. If you have 15 individuals responding to your survey in round one, you really want to get as many of those 15 individuals also responding in rounds 4 or 5 if you go that far. So generally, we like to see at least 70% of response rate in each round. And this is more of a threshold for those larger Delphi studies, where they have large panel of experts. I'm of the belief or philosophy that if you have a small enough group of 8 to 10 or 10 to 15 individuals, you can really probably achieve that 90 to 100% response rate in each round, barring any unforeseen circumstances that arise for those panels of experts. But you really want to try and maintain that group all the way through every round as much as possible. Okay, so I am going to stop here. This is just kind of meant to have been a brief introduction and overview of the Delphi method. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Asif, who will kind of walk through one of his examples in sports of exercise medicine.
Perfect. So Steph, thanks for going over that first part, because it really tees me up for the second half. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's full name is Irfan Asif. I'm over at UAB. And I've spent a lot of time with AMSSM and actually was on the board of directors from 2015 to 2019. And one of the roles I took when I was on the board of directors was to chair the fellowship committee. And I'm really passionate about fellowship education. And one of the things we thought about was how could we make all fellowships better in their training? So we started to work on a document sort of thinking about sort of the fellowship standards of excellence. And so when we began thinking about the fellowship standards of excellence, we started to note that there actually weren't any number of experiences or procedures or things that you needed in order to do your training. There were certainly some outlines, but it didn't say you needed a certain number of exercise tests, a certain number of orthotics or gait analysis or nutritional analysis. And so that process of going through the writing of the fellowship standards of excellence really opened my eyes that we could do a better job in fellowship training, in particular, trying to figure out the numbers of experiences to help determine when a fellow might be competent in training. When we got done with that, some folks internationally actually approached us, led by some sports and exercise medicine experts in Australia, about writing some documents using a Delphi process to create a syllabus for sports and exercise medicine. So it was a really nice segue from that original document that we tried to write more on a national level to something that led to international training standards. And so that was my first foray into learning about the Delphi process. And so I learned some skills. We actually wrote 2 documents on that. And then more recently, many of you guys may have attended the 2021 CRN Summit on Exercise Medicine and Physical Activity Promotion. And so as we were putting together the summit, we thought, well, one of the things we want to do is actually improve medical education in the space of this exercise medicine and physical activity promotion. But similarly to what we had talked about earlier, there weren't actually good guidelines on how you should incorporate exercise medicine into medical school training, residency, or fellowship training. So we put together a group of 9 experts, and we tried really hard to make sure that the expertise was balanced between men and women. We tried to include people from the international spaces as well as within the US. We tried to include experts from the different areas of medical school, residency, and fellowship training. So we really tried to work within a balanced team. What we did was actually put together a survey, and we actually did the survey within SurveyMonkey. And the idea was that we were going to do what Steph asked, was to ask people. Ultimately, it could lead to 2 rounds, but we tried our best to put something on paper within the first round that people might agree with. The goal was to shoot for 80% agreement, and we wanted a 100% response rate. But if we didn't get 80%, we'd query the group about what they might think, and then we might rewrite the statement to see if we could mirror something that would get a better response rate. So within our document, we actually worked on 3 levels. So the curriculum included something called a domain. And then under the domain, if you think about like an outline, a general learning area. And then the third was a specific learning area. So it's basically an outline with a 1, 2, and 3 that goes from domain to general learning and then specific learning areas. And as Steph outlined, we started to look for trying to get at least 80% agreement. And so we showed everybody after we got done with each round, we gave everyone the statistics and we showed these are the areas where we agreed and then these are the areas where we didn't agree. Let's have a discussion about how to improve it. And then if it warranted, we had a second round. Ultimately, it led to a document that we submitted for publication. And it looks like this. So the domain would be Foundations of Exercise Medicine and Physical Activity Promotion within the med school curriculum. Under 1.1 in the general learning areas, we start talking about the basics of exercise in health and medicine. And then we have specific learning areas, bullets 1.1, 0.1, 0.2, and 0.3 that we all decided was part of the curriculum as part of our consensus process. Sorry, this one looks a little fuzzy on my screen. I apologize. But the idea within the curriculum is that we went over areas that were good for medical knowledge. We also gave each of the trainees some practical elements that they would practice on their rotations to make sure that they solidified their experience. We gave people some optional content that they could pursue if they had additional time. And then we also gave some feedback on how to get an assessment of the performance for the trainee. And so you'll see this document, again, we've submitted it to the British Journal of Sports Medicine, and hopefully it'll ultimately improve the training that you get as fellows, as well as what you might see in residency and med school levels. Forthcoming from this, we actually have educational modules that will actually supplement the curriculum that we're providing for you. So you'll be able to do this curriculum regardless of what fellowship you're in. So stay tuned for this. These will probably be available in early 2022. So to sort of summarize what Steph had started with, there's not a single agreed upon method for the Delphi process. You don't really get a right or wrong answer, but it is a good way to sort of build some consensus. Remember, though, that if you are building consensus, it doesn't always mean that you've come up with the correct answer. I think Steph laid out a good, framework where you might go through a 1 round or 2 rounds. And similar to what Steph has here, we used 2 weeks for each of our different surveys that we did. And I think as Steph outlines, it's a really good launching point for thinking about how to get rigorous and data-driven research. So for us in the space of the curriculum, it actually gave us some benchmarks, and now we can hopefully implement this within fellowship education and then sort of assess, did we train fellows better in the long run? So would love to think about questions with you all and answer. I think this is something that's been pretty new and over the past few years for me in my research career, but I think it's something that a lot of people are using. So you will definitely see it within the literature during your training. So thanks, everyone.